Man, every time I felt that urge to go after world domination, I'd always feel guilty about my Jewish 1/8. Maybe I should feel bad about my Anglo-Saxon 3/8. At least I still have my Scots-Irish 1/4. Do I sound obsessed with race? So have so many lately. And so many in the church falling into this same stupid trap. I have been enjoying watching Christians in my church and in my denomination push back against dumbness within the church. And Pastor Douglas Wilson, a pastor of a church in my denomination here in Moscow, and a spiritual father of mine. He has a wonderful little video / blog post that came out today, and I want to talk to you guys about it a little bit. I say video / blog post because he records his blog posts, just kind of reading them on camera, and that's how I usually see them. So Bat Guano Crazy was his latest. Now, over at Canon Press, he's got a new book that's just come out called American Milk and Honey, Anti-Semitism, the Promise of Deuteronomy, and the True Israel of God. There's one of the 5 pointed stars that one finds on the Stars and Stripes, and then the Star of David there on the bottom. I don't know what the main thrust, the push of the book is. The Jews are a prodigal older brother. When they come home, it will be glory for the world. How should we think of them in the meantime? You all know that I object to how Pastor Wilson has tried to frame hard supersessionism the way that he has, and I have a video, which is on the side, a video over here that you guys can check out. Meanwhile, I am enormously appreciative of him just being willing to call Christians who are anti-Semites. He's not willing to call them buffoons, but he's willing to call them out for their buffoonery. So, just about there. He's doing a great job. And so I want to talk about this article. There are 2 big reasons to read it. The second half, less interesting for me, but it may be interesting for you, as you may have some friends who would benefit from reading it. So the second half is addressing a couple of tropes, a couple of memes in the old-fashioned sense of the word, that have come up in the darker corners of the internet recently regarding Jews and Judaism. Throughout the article, he sort of talks about the place that Jews have as a minority, the same way, say, the Chinese have in Malaysia. Somehow, the Chinese in Malaysia get blamed for a lot of the same things that the Jews were scapegoated for in Europe. And he brings up, I think very relevantly, that it feels artificial for us here in the United States, who don't have that centuries-long history of Jewish and Christian dwelling together and all the complications of that. So it just feels really artificial to kind of jumpstart that here. We have other ethnic histories at play. Anyway, so the second half is mostly about that, and some of these darker corners and shedding light on them. Fine. The first half was for me very, very fun. There's almost a Chestertonian and Wodehouseian even tone to it, and there's a Wodehouseian moment that I want to share with you guys. So herein, A Massive Failure to Read the Room, he starts talking about how a certain segment of the population not only feels disenfranchised, abandoned, lied to, ripped off, but that they want to know who's responsible, right? Why can't it, the way he puts it is, people, the insurance sellers want to know why they can't just go sell insurance. But there is also outsider stupidity. There is also the stupidity of the ardent activist who took his very first red pill just 6 months ago and who has no worldview framework for housing all of the things he has read in the course of those 6 months. When you go down the wormhole of websites, it is hard to remember what you read where. Some of it was sane, some of it was responsible, some of it was what his grandfather tried to tell him a few times, and a bunch of it was just bat guano crazy. If anyone tries to take him aside and explain to him just how crazy it is, that explainer has a steep hill to climb. Okay, so this perhaps you've encountered folks like this recently, and it's a trap to even be an explainer. This is why I think you have to take a tone more like this, which is very gentle, very kind, because Pastor Wilson is very gentle and very kind. But you have to make fun of. You have to point out the absurdities. What you can't do is explain, because what you're doing is you are explaining to noticers. Right? They notice the conspiracies. They notice the ploys. I've just noticed that these things are happening and that there are these connections. I'm just noticing. And of course, the one thing the noticers are noticing are all the explanations. This is why it's so salutary to read Chesterton's Orthodoxy and to read how he talks about insanity. So one cannot explain to the noticers. They are expecting an explanation. And what's more, they're expecting an explanation that makes sense. It's best just to make fun of them. You can do so kindly, sometimes. This is because to be red-pilled at all is to struggle with the fact that you have been lied to about virtually everything your entire life, and those lies were affirmed by the insider stupidity guardians, all of them nodding solemnly. And let us be frank, the establishment did lie, and more than a little bit. It's not for nothing that this is, so we have a complex of things at play here, and not simply through coincidence, right? There are many people in the world with agendas, and things are coming to a head. Marxism, critical theory, critical race theory, all coming together beautifully and abusively. And boom, all those COVID-19 restrictions. It is not for nothing that so many people are taking these red pills. At least they think they're red. I hope they're not poison pills. It is absolutely objectionable that the powers that be stepped over the bounds of freedom the way they did, and now they are part of an unspoken conspiracy. Just everybody who was complicit in believing all that COVID nonsense is now complicit in insisting that we all forget it. People still feel that. People still resist that. That's going to leave a scar in our country. It is already not being talked about in the loudest ways possible. You will do your community, your family, a great favor by never forgetting. And when you're 62 years old, 40 years from now, or whatever that is, be the kind of grandpa who comes with a warning label. Hey, if you go hang out with him, he may just want to talk to you about what they did in 2020. Anyway, so these neophyte outsider recruits become an easy prey for someone who offered to explain everything to them, right? Grand unifying theories. I'm telling you, read Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Enter the clever mental gymnastic ability of the cranks, laser-focused on the point they intend to make, come hell or high water, and with everything outside that laser beam shrouded in obscurity. The problem is that pretty much all of reality that is outside that laser beam. I think there's one too many that's there. The laser beam guys are monomaniacal. They write big, fat books. Following them are the regular foot soldiers, the people who need a cause. They usually don't need a cause back in ordinary times, because in ordinary times they were content to sell insurance or perhaps aluminum siding. But in these troubled times, when normalcy got clipped on the side of the head by the commies, these regular guys took to the streets, and they are hot for an explanation. We really are in the middle of a civilizational fight, which the church is in the middle of. But it's actually not the church versus the world. It is traditional Westernness versus communism. The church has a clear side in that, but it's dangerous to conflate Westernness with the church. Absolutely dangerous. Anyway, there are many, many people outside the church, and I have met many people who have been attracted to the Christian church in recent years because they see, oh, look, there's a sort of co-belligerence going on here. For some of those people, this brings them to Jesus Christ and to his church, because then they begin to see what the world really is all about. And it's not about the fight against the communists, as important as that may be. But for a lot of them, they simply want the church to be, the community that they lacked all along as they sought their cause and looked for their war to fight. We in the church cannot let that be. We cannot. Do not let your church be co-opted by people who want to use it as a base camp for what they think is the greater cause. Anyway, there's then a very fun sort of Chestertonian moment, which I'm actually going to play on video for you. So this is an imagined, actually, here, let me read you one last little bit. So in these troubled times, when normalcy got clipped on the head by the side of the commies, these regular guys took to the streets, and they are hot for an explanation. They need an explanation as to why they can't make it selling insurance anymore. Aha! Well, there will be someone here to tell you. Okay? So, Pastor Wilson, in the voice of that someone here to tell you what is going on.
Ahem, a professorial someone says. It was the Jews all along. I tried to make the case for all this in my dissertation at Ball State in 1987, but I was run out of the department by the Rothschilds. I've been fighting for vindication ever since, and believe that my hour is come. Ah, said I. I knew it had to be somebody. We stood for a moment and thought. I ventured to speak again, somewhat timidly. Are you sure it wasn't the Anglo-Saxons? You know, Margaret Sanger, John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson. Never heard of them, the man said.
This is the line that actually made me decide to do a video.
Are you sure it wasn't the Anglo-Saxons? You know, Margaret Sanger, John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson.
So good. Margaret Sanger, John
we stood
Dewey,
for a moment and
Woodrow
thought.
Wilson.
I ventured to speak again, somewhat timidly. Are you sure it wasn't the Anglo-Saxons? You know.
Oh, man. Yeah, it was the Anglo-Saxons. You know, one of the things that doesn't really get unpacked in Pastor Wilson's article/video is that it can't be the Anglo-Saxons precisely because of the feeling of impotence, right? And in fact, the impotence of the Anglo-Saxon bad guys makes sense, right? They are simply tools. Again, you can't explain. You can only make fun of. Because if you explain, they will have their own explanation. Yes, in fact, Woodrow Wilson was a tool of Jewish bankers. Margaret Sanger was a tool of Jewish communists, etc., etc., etc. These poor little Anglo-Saxon tin pot dictators had no real agency, just as I have no real agency. Yeah. So it can't be the Anglo-Saxons, but oh, it is the Anglo-Saxons and all the other bad people out there. Come to the church, y'all. You know, I've been working on a lot of projects having to do with poetry recently, and I've just been compiling a small collection of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and I love it. I love how Christian the Anglo-Saxons became upon their conversion. Take note, you, of how many Thor's hammers you see around people's necks these days. Look at any social media stuff having to do with Nordic or Germanic peoples. They're explicitly pagan. Explicitly pagan. People don't want the church. The church actually ends up standing in their way. The moment people at my church started realizing, oh, you know, this is a bit of a problem. You know, some of these folks getting into the whole blaming Jews people, like some of them are starting to hang around and feel slightly comfortable. Let's not. Boom. Let's say something. Yeah. That's it. Those folks are gone. They were never really a part of what was going on. And it didn't take much. Yeah, all it took was a little signal that, no, we are the Church of Jesus Christ. That's what we are. So don't let yourself get distracted. Stay as the Church of Jesus Christ. And if there are young folks in your church who are, I say young folks, but it's not all young folks, is it? But if there are folks in your church who are they're just invested in these conspiracies, instead of being invested in building up the Church of Christ and triumphing through defeat and triumphing through obedience and triumphing through sacrifice and triumphing through considering others as better than themselves. Let them go. Let them go. Just like with any other sin that can get into the church, there are certain prices in fellowship that are too high to pay, right? If an adulterer came to your church and sought forgiveness and restoration, then he would receive that. But if an adulterer came to your church and insisted on being told that his adultery was okay, or that his adultery was necessary in these times because of feminism or whatnot, would you tolerate that? Of course you would not. So we should not with all of this nonsense. And again, don't try to explain, right? Noticers expect explanations. The completeness. Actually, I'm going to go grab Chesterton. Make it make sense. I want to read to you guys from a chapter called The Maniac in G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Let us begin, then, with the madhouse. From this evil and fantastic inn, let us set forth on our intellectual journey. Now, if we are to glance at the philosophy of sanity, the first thing to do in the matter is to blot out one big and common mistake. There is a notion adrift everywhere that imagination, especially mystical imagination, is dangerous to man's mental balance. Poets are commonly spoken of as psychologically unreliable. And generally, there is a vague association between wreathing laurels in your hair and sticking straws in it. Facts and history utterly contradict this view. Most of the very great poets have not only been sane, but extremely businesslike. And if Shakespeare ever really held horses, it was because he was much the safest man to hold them. Imagination does not breed insanity. Exactly what does breed insanity is reason. Poets do not go mad, but chess players do. Mathematicians go mad, and cashiers, but creative artists very seldom. I am not, as will be seen, in any sense attacking logic. I only say that this danger does lie in logic, not in imagination. Artistic paternity is as wholesome as physical paternity. Moreover, it is worthy of remark that when a poet really was morbid, it was commonly because he had some weak spot of rationality on his brain. Poe, for instance, really was morbid, not because he was poetical, but because he was specially analytical. Even chess was too poetical for him. He disliked chess because it was full of knights and castles, like a poem. He avowedly preferred the black discs of drafts, i.e. checkers, because they were more like the mere black dots on a diagram. Remember, we're still talking about looking for the reason, the grand unifying theory, and the reasons behind everything. We're just having a nice, ample, generous reading because I love this chapter. Poetry is sane because it floats easily in an infinite sea. Reason seeks to cross the infinite sea and so make it finite. The result is mental exhaustion, like the physical exhaustion of Mr. Holbein. There are a few references here and there to earlier writings and comments. To accept everything is an exercise. To understand everything a strain. The poet only desires exaltation and expansion, a world to stretch himself in. The poet only asks to get his head into heaven. It is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head, and it is his head that splits. It is a small matter, but not irrelevant, that this striking mistake is commonly supported by a striking misquotation. We have all heard people cite the celebrated line of Dryden as, "Great genius is to madness near allied." But Dryden did not say that great genius was to madness near allied. Dryden was a great genius himself and knew better. It would have been hard to find a man more romantic than he or more sensible. What Dryden said was this: great wits are oft to madness near allied, and that is true. It is the pure promptitude of the intellect that is in peril of a breakdown. Also, people might remember of what sort of man Dryden was talking. He was not talking of an unworldly visionary like Vaughan or George Herbert. He was talking of a cynical man of the world, a skeptic, a diplomatist, a great practical politician. Such men are indeed to madness near allied. Their incessant calculations of their own brains and other people's brains is a dangerous trade. It is always perilous to the mind to reckon up the mind. A flippant person has asked why we say as mad as a hatter. A more flippant person might answer that a hatter is mad because he... this line deserves better delivery. A more flippant person might answer that a hatter is mad because he has to measure the human head. And then this is the last major portion I'll read. If great reasoners are often maniacal, it is equally true that maniacs are commonly great reasoners. When I was engaged in a controversy with a Clarion on the matter of free will, that able writer, Mr. R.B. Suthers, said that free will was lunacy because it meant causeless actions, and the actions of a lunatic would be causeless. I do not dwell here upon the disastrous lapse in determinist logic. Obviously, if any actions, even a lunatic's, can be causeless, determinism is done for. If the chain of causation can be broken for a madman, it can be broken for a man. But my purpose is to point out something more practical. It was natural, perhaps, that a modern Marxian socialist should not know anything about free will. But it was certainly remarkable that a modern Marxian socialist should not know anything about lunatics. By the way, Chesterton, going to rhetorical war with Marxian socialists. We've been fighting the same battle for a while. Mr. Suthers evidently did not know anything about lunatics. The last thing that can be said of a lunatic is that his actions are causeless. If any human acts may loosely be called causeless, they are the minor acts of a healthy man. whistling as he walks, slashing the grass with a stick, kicking his heels or rubbing his hands. It is the happy man who does the useless things. The sick man is not strong enough to be idle. It is exactly such careless and causeless actions that the madman could never understand. For the madman, like the determinist, generally sees too much cause in everything. The madman would read a conspiratorial significance into those empty activities. He would think that the lopping of the grass was an attack on private property. He would think that the kicking of the heels was a signal to an accomplice. If the madman could for an instant become careless, he would become sane. Everyone who has had the misfortune to talk with people in the heart or on the edge of mental disorder knows that their most sinister quality is a horrible clarity of detail, a connecting of one thing with another in a map more elaborate than a maze. If you argue with a madman, it is extremely probable that you will get the worst of it, for in many ways his mind moves all the quicker for not being delayed by the things that go with good judgment. He is not hampered by a sense of humor or by charity or by the dumb certainties of experience. He is the more logical for losing certain sane affections. Indeed, the common phrase for insanity is in this respect a misleading one. The madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. The madman's explanation of a thing is always complete, and often, in a purely rational sense, satisfactory. This is why you cannot explain to the noticers. Or to speak more strictly, the insane explanation, if not conclusive, is at least unanswerable. This may be observed especially in the 2 or 3 commonest kinds of madness. If a man says, for instance, that men have a conspiracy against him, you cannot dispute it, except by saying that all the men deny that they are conspirators, which is exactly what conspirators would do. His explanation covers the facts as much as yours. Or if a man says that he is the rightful king of England, it is no complete answer to say that the existing authorities call him mad, for if he were king of England, that might be the wisest thing for the existing authorities to do. Or if a man says that he is Jesus Christ, it is no answer to tell him that the world denies his divinity, for the world denied Christ's. Nevertheless, he is wrong. But if we attempt to trace his error in exact terms, we shall not find it quite so easy as we had supposed. Perhaps the nearest we can get to expressing it is to say this, that his mind moves in a perfect but narrow circle. A small circle is quite as infinite as a large circle, but, though it is quite as infinite, it is not so large. In the same way, the insane explanation is quite as complete as the sane one, but it is not so large. A bullet is quite as round as the world, but it is not the world. There is such a thing as a narrow universality. There is such a thing as a small and cramped eternity. You may see it in many modern religions. Now, speaking quite externally and empirically, we may say that the strongest and most unmistakable mark of madness is this combination between a logical completeness and a spiritual contraction. The lunatic's theory explains a large number of things, but it does not explain them in a large way. If you have noticed in your church a difficulty of dealing charitably with the rational maniacs, and we see this manifest itself in small ways that are usually healed, right? Like cage stage Calvinism. But, and there are pet conspiracies. So the stuff we were addressing early in the video, that's what's going on today. Tomorrow it may be another thing. There's a particular crisis going on today. Part of the reason for your troubles may very well be the patience shown. As long as people tempted by this sort of thinking are willing to show some charity and to show submission and to listen, then of course they should be welcome. But as Chesterton so aptly points out, and I think you will observe this in your own experience, everything is shed, but for reason. So there is no more charity, for example. And their approach to tactics and interpersonal tactics end up being the same as any Marxists. Their mission is more important than the church's. And in fact, any church that doesn't understand that has been corrupted by the conspirators. Anyway, all this to say, all this begun by just that hilarious line. Are you sure it wasn't the Anglo-Saxons? You know, Margaret Sanger, John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson. I approve, by the way, of using the word Anglo-Saxons. There's so many things I could have gone off with the Anglo-Saxon poetry thing. And this wasn't why I brought him up originally. But one of my favorite translators of Old English poetry, and Old English is the term most often used. I have very old books called Old English poetry. Often the terms are used interchangeably. But this guy posted, he has amazing resources, amazing translations. I don't know what precisely motivated him to post this, but he had a little thing on his website about using the term Old English now instead of Anglo-Saxon. Now, since I approach these things primarily linguistically, my default was to refer to Old English. But now, I think I may try to make my default just to use the term Anglo-Saxon, just because the Anglo-Saxons were awesome. You know what else I'm doing right now? I am rereading The White Horse King by Ben Merkel, which is a fun, light history of Alfred the Great. One of the things that's great about it, it is sort of light. I wouldn't go so far as to say fluffy, but it's definitely a light, popular history. It is not burdened by, so many academics feel an obligation to not sound ridiculous, to not sound like they're writing a hagiography. And Alfred was an awesome butt kicker. So to write a history, especially a popular one, in which it doesn't seem like you're engaged in a little bit of hero worship, Merkel handles that very, very nicely and even addresses that problem. But yeah, I mean, Alfred was awesome. So I'm in the middle of writing a bunch of stuff about how manly it is to be a poet, and about how Anglo-Saxons talked about poets. And in fact, a warrior had his word hoard. So I've been sort of preparing a lot of that, including reading some of Alfred's stuff. Alfred didn't learn Latin until he was a teenager, which is super, super late. Okay, like it's that's almost like a 21st century kid. He was extremely Anglo-Saxon in his arts. And he wrote Anglo-Saxon poetry himself. Of course he did, because he was a king. Anglo-Saxon kings wrote poetry. They had their word hoards. Anyway, enough about that. Anglo-Saxons are awesome. And they are awesome enough that eventually their descendants could be as awesomely wicked as any others. Woodrow Wilson, you suck. All right. So long, everyone. The peace of Christ be upon you.
What day is it today? Remind me.
It's Sunday, Mr. Pension.
Sunday. And what do we do on a Sunday morning, wherever we happen to be? We go to church, you bloody heathen!